I am your host, Lauren, and today I'm joined by Christy, and we are going to answer some of the questions. So if you were at T-Rock a few weeks ago, we did something called You Asked For It, which is basically where all of our college students get to text in questions live during a sermon, and we get to answer them. And there was an overwhelming amount of questions. And so we are going to film, a couple of podcast episodes just answering all of your questions. So I hope if you ask questions that weren't answered the night of, you will tune in and listen to this. So we're going to dive right in. Today on this episode, it'll be 2 episodes over 2 weeks. But on this episode, we're going to talk all about relationships and friendships. So you ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
Okay. So the first question is, it says, my friend's boyfriend is making her his idol. In turn, is losing herself because she is trying so hard to make him feel like he is worthy. What advice should I give her to try and bring this issue to light and help her through it?
Well, first, we all make terrible gods.
Yeah.
So the more that she pours out from an empty cup, she's going to fill that. And ultimately, praying for someone, meeting them where they're at, and being there for them is the only thing we can do. Mm-hmm. It's more important that we don't try to let what we can't control us.
Yeah.
Because sometimes when we try to tell somebody something that they're not ready to hear, it ends up pushing them away rather than drawing them near. So until she starts filling that drain, she will figure it out. But we've got to support them, kind of meet them where they're at, point it out when it's appropriate and soft.
Yeah. I think always approaching it in like a loving and I want to help you way. And if they don't respond in a good way, like don't attack them for it.
Yeah,
just lay back and eventually just be the friend that you would want in that situation.
Absolutely.
And eventually they will turn and figure it out.
They will.
So I feel like that was good. Okay, next question. When you're looking for someone to marry, is it wrong when it's set up to swipe left and right? So with this question, because it was a little longer, they were asking about how do you view Christian dating sites? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Or in a world where there's so modernized with technology, is that okay to turn to those kind of things?
So God uses everything. Absolutely. I think it's important we don't put him in a box and think he can't use something, because he sure can. But we have to be careful of our own state of desperation and pushing something versus waiting on God. So absolutely, swiping left or right, God can be in it all. Just don't compromise your standards based on a left or right swipe that you make or someone else makes towards you. At the end of the day, whoever God is leading us to, we don't need to settle.
Yeah. And I think knowing that, like, dating apps just in general, like, are a thing of the now, like, it's just happening. But knowing that also the internet is not always true. And don't put identity in who somebody is just by what you're seeing on that. And I think it's an okay place to start, but don't allow that to define the relationship from the very beginning, because you're setting yourself up for failure with that.
Absolutely. His timing's perfect regardless.
Yes, for sure. And I know people who actually have served at this church who met their spouses on dating websites and are getting married now. Like, it's not a terrible thing.
No.
And I used to laugh when I think of one friend in particular, because she would be like, I can't tell our pastors that I met him on Bumble. And I'm like, girl, like, it's not like it's a bad, like, yes, there's a bad rap on things like Tinder and Bumble. But at the end of the day, like, that doesn't mean that all people on there are bad. And I think sometimes it can be used for bad, sometimes it can be used for good. So just using the Bible and God as your judgment through all of that is the most important thing.
Heart motives. Mm-hmm. So, I think without saying it, we might as well say it, is if you're on a hookup app for a hookup, be mindful of what you're going to find there. Yeah. But if you really are trusting God for your person, he can use everything, but it makes a lot more sense to look in the places to find your person.
Yeah. Okay, next question. How do you deal with temptation in relationships? I feel like this is a huge thing.
Yes. Well, one, you have to know your weaknesses and then set up the boundaries to avoid where you're going to fall into those areas of temptations.
And I think I don't want to cut you off, but we
No,
talked about this
was
the night that we did the questions answered, and I think it's so important in today's society. We are so scared of setting up boundaries and scared of doing that at the beginning of a relationship. But in reality, like, that should be one of your top priorities in getting into a relationship, because if you are not, and I'm speaking from my past of like being in relationships and that not being like the first thing that you talk about, and then months down the road these temptations come, but you've never talked about them and you've never understood whether you're on the same page or not, and now you're in a 6-month, year-long relationship and you're breaking up and destroying this relationship that you once thought was good because you didn't go over boundaries on the first date.
Absolutely. And after you've defined those boundaries and created that, you're going to quickly find out whether someone is in it for things that are different convictions for you, and once they have that, they're going to be gone anyway. Or if y'all have drawn the boundaries and they continue pushing them, that can also be a red flag that you can choose to or not to ignore, and kind of know really where the heart is. But that's hard to know if you haven't drawn those boundaries.
And I think that, like, truthfully, if you are like rooting your relationship with God, and you yourself can root your relationship with God, like, it should be both party things, but if you are rooting yourself in God, when those boundaries, I mean, in reality, like, I think we can both say, like, boundaries are going to get pushed at some point in your relationship.
Absolutely.
And it just, I mean, we're human. That's what's going to happen. But I think about how you and your partner approach the boundaries that are getting pushed is what will really set the standard. Because if you're with somebody who is, you know, you've established those boundaries, say you've taken that first initiative to establish those boundaries, and then, like you said, they start pushing and pushing, and you stand firm on your boundaries, but they don't, then that's probably a sign that they're not in the right space as you are. And
it's hard and awkward even when you feel like you're in the right space. When John and I were in college, I mean, it was hard, and there were times we knew each other's boundaries, but even the closer that we got to marriage, he was a youth pastor. We'd get in these situations that we knew we shouldn't be in, and he'd be like, I think we need to stop and pray. And it was hard, and it was awkward. And I'd be like, now? Can we stop right now and pray? And there was times we did absolutely that. And there was times that we didn't. And we both felt, you know, really bad afterwards, and that was stuff God didn't want for us, and we didn't want for our relationship. So it's hard enough even when you're on the same page versus having to fight someone else to keep those convictions.
Well, and I think also, like, with that is there will also be times where you could be on the same page and fall, and how are you going to approach that fall of, like, okay, well, we've done it once, it's okay to do it forever, or are we going to say, no, this isn't right, we need to get back on track? And so I think as humans, you're never going to be in a perfect relationship. You're never going to be with somebody who, I mean, like I said, boundaries are going to be pushed. Like, that's just going to happen. But how you approach that whole situation of, like, are we going to honor God even in our mess ups, or are we going to just give him because we've done it once, or we've messed up once, or we've fallen once, like, and so I think it's important to be with somebody who prioritizes the same things as you,
walk with Christ,
but then also prioritizes their relationship with Christ and how y'all's relationship is building towards Christ.
Absolutely.
So, okay. Next, how to heal from severe grief relationship-wise, or the actual loss of somebody. So whether that be like actual...
I love that both kinds were defined, because I tell people all the time that grieving the loss of someone who's still alive and not choosing you is almost just as painful as grieving someone who is no longer here, especially if they knew Christ and you know where they're at. So the best way that I would answer that is to know that there is stages to grief, 5 stages, and there's no perfect order and there's no process. So be kind to yourself through grieving. And that is shock and disillusionment that it's happening, whether that's a breakup or you just found out that you lost someone through the loss of life. So there's grief, and then there is, shock and disillusionment. And then there's sad, there's mad, there's realizing the changes and differences, and then there's acceptance. So going through those, the sad, the mad, the realizing how many things are different and adjusting to those things. Even with the loss of a pet, I had a college student the other day that was coming in grieving the loss of a pet. It's like, I come home and I'm used to them being there and they're not. So grief, there's no perfect quick fix. Be kind to yourself. There's no order, but you can recognize the stages of grief and what you're going through and be kind to yourself through that. Any change really can be loss. People had feelings of grief all through 2020, losing things like prom and having to reschedule maybe their wedding and things like that. They didn't understand what was going on with them, and it was grief.
Yeah. And I think like a lot of times, because when you mentioned pets, I was like, that's me. My parents just lost their last dog. They've had 2 dogs. They lost one several months ago and then lost one a couple weeks ago very unexpectedly. And traveling through that with them, and I often catch myself like when I'm explaining it to people of like, I know it's stupid, but, and everybody will answer exactly that. Like, no grief, I think, is dumb or stupid, especially to God. And so don't, like you said, show yourself grace, because that's what our God would do. And I think it's hard, and especially with all of the different stages and all of the different, I mean, grief is not just set in stone for somebody who physically passes away.
Before you get to acceptance and recognizing the changes of life, you might waffle through sad and mad and feel like you've gotten this far and then you regressed back. And that's just part of it, the different things that go on in our daily life that might remind you of that relationship or the loss of that life. And so
that's good. Okay, how do I build a relationship with God and strengthen my walk while also building one with my partner?
I think it's ensuring that your partner is equally yoked with you. So y'all need to be growing. If you are growing with your partner, y'all need to be growing together in the Lord. When you are actually that person's person, there's going to be seasons that y'all complement each other because one person is really pressing into the Lord and the other may be at a different place. But while you're building in the foundation of that, I think it is really key that y'all are equally yoked, that y'all are both pursuing the same things in Christ. Because the way that y'all grow together is to grow in the Lord. Matthew says, seek ye first the kingdom and all these things will be added. Love in the way that the world views love and the flesh views love is very different than agape unconditional love. The whole 1 Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, love is not easily angered, love keeps no record of wrong. It's really hard to grow what true love is with a person if you don't understand God love.
And I think like always, I mean, if you truly are longing to be in a relationship that honors Christ, there will always be an understanding of God has blessed you with that relationship. And I remember in a previous relationship praying to God literally from the moment that me and this guy started dating until we broke up. I would pray every night, like, God, I want to honor you with this. If this is not what you have for me, take him away. Like, I will not be sad. I will gladly go on your walk.
Wow, that's bold
and
a lot easier said than done.
Several years ago, you would have never caught me praying that. And then I heard somebody say, like, if you truly trust God, pray the bold prayers. And I have stuck by that ever since of like, and I've prayed bold prayers in several different areas of my life, and I've always saw God show up, and it hasn't always been in the ways that I wanted. But I was able to exit that relationship with such a like understanding of like, this just wasn't what God wanted for me. And I look back now and I'm like, I see why. And I'm in a relationship now, and every moment is rooted in God. And hard times have come, and I think that that's like a misunderstanding that the world has given us, especially around Christianity, is like, if God gifts you something, it's gonna be perfect and whole and beautiful. And that's just, every second is beautiful, but not beautiful in the way that the world explains beauty. And it's gonna be hard, but are you trusting in God through those days? And me and James have a conversation all the time of, it's not us against each other in a problem, it's us against the problem.
Absolutely.
Because if you are not, I mean, truthfully, like, if you truly believe that God has blessed you with that person, like, you are a team and you are working towards the kingdom and for God's betterment. And that doesn't always mean like around people. That means with just you two. And like, how are you going to respond to that person when you're fighting? How are you going to respond to that person when they need you? Like, and so I think truthfully, just keeping God at the center of everything, he will either show up in...
It's the only way, like James says, to count it joy when you face trials. It's the only way that you can do that is with the peace of God and having a person that also understands. I mean, you said it, that, hey, we aren't the enemy here. We're on the same team. A lot of people will come into the office and say, well, if it's meant to be, it just shouldn't be this hard. And that is so crazy. We have got too much Disney. I'm like, who says that? Because we are two imperfect people trying to seek a perfect love. And in Christ, nonetheless, right? Like, not in the flesh of meeting each other's needs and serving each other, like in the eros way, in the flesh serving way, but like beyond lust, there is this love. And if we are looking for God love in our imperfect selves, that's hard. It takes hard work, and we're willing to work so hard for everything, but then think that this is just supposed to fairy tale naturally work itself out. So grow together, growing towards God. And if you really are pursuing God and your person isn't, that's probably going to grow further apart naturally, whether or not you want it to grow together or not.
Yep. Okay, last question for the relationship side of things. How do you know if they are the one?
Nice. Well, be prayed up. Be prayed up. I always say 2 believers, because they have Jesus, can make it work. Like, I always have said that. 2 people come into a counseling and they have to love Jesus and love each other and believe in the covenant, not contract, of a marriage relationship. And a lot of people will just say, I just knew they were the one. I've heard your testimony and how God spoke really clearly to you. God spoke that very, very clearly to John and I. But I don't think it always has to work that way. I think that we need to be pursuing God and the things of God and faith. The nature of faith in Hebrew says it's believing in what you cannot see. So if you are listening for God's voice and you're looking for him in your life, he might show up in that other person. And I think that the point is not to ignore things that are not God. Let the red flags be red flags, but pay attention to the peace that is there with the person. I wish that it was like you and I, that God would say, this is your person. I knew it undoubtedly when I wasn't looking, and when I was probably even fighting, believing in forever. And
I think even for me, like, I talk about all the time the story of like how God told me like James was going to be the one, but also I don't mention a lot that James and I were friends for a very long time before that. And so when that moment came, I was like, are you serious, God? Like, he's one of my close friends, but like, there's no way. But trusting in the facts of like when God chose out like somebody who had been there. And I remember I laugh all the time because when James and I were just friends and I was going through the breakup of the relationship before him, we were sitting at a Fuzzy's one day, and the guy who I had dated before him, we had already broken up, but I was just in that stage where I feel like most like high school and college girls are, of like where they don't want to let go of that person. And I still had a heart next to this guy's name, and James looks down at me, and we're totally platonic friends at this time, and he goes, who's that? And I was like, that's my ex-boyfriend. Like, I just can't bring myself to delete the heart. And he reaches over and grabs my phone and just deletes it for me. And it's like, you don't need this in your life.
Yes, boundaries and boundaries.
And so I think like, but at that moment, we were just friends.
Yeah.
And for a long time, we were just friends. And God used him to help me through a really hard time in my life. And then when the time was right, he said, here you go. This is actually what I wanted out of this. And so it's not always going to be somebody who's brought in like just as a relationship. It's not always going to be somebody who you're super close friends with. I think everybody's love story is different. And I mean, I think one of our college girls spoke about it one night, Sierra, at our ladies' night, and said, I love that we just get to fellowship together because it's girls pouring into other girls. And she looked at another girl who had asked questions about relationships, and she said, Emma, you are not
So
promised a husband.
Yes.
You are promised a love from God, but you are not promised a love from another man on this earth.
That's right.
And you
That
can
was
pray
good.
and hope that that is in God's plan for you, but you are not promised that. And so you have to become content with solely the love of God. And if that is his plan for you, he will provide. And I think that when we are obedient in his callings for us, he will provide with wants sometimes.
In his timing.
Yes. And it's not always going to be like, God, give me a relationship. And then a week later, he's going to bless you with it. Like,
That's right.
just because he says not now doesn't mean that it's a bad thing.
Yeah. It's not no
Yeah.
necessarily.
And so
Awesome.
I think, yeah, that's it. Do you have anything else to add?
No.
Okay.
So good.
Let's move on to friendship. So, just a couple questions. How do I help a friend see that the relationship she is in is not healthy and is changing her in a negative way? I think we kind of covered
I
this.
feel like it was covered in the last one, and it is meet them where they're at, but they're not going to hear it or receive it if they're not in the place to. So make sure you're invited into that conversation. And what I mean by that is wait for a right time when they're acknowledging, noticing some things that are different and allowing you to speak into that, because you don't want them to isolate themselves when they're already in a bad situation from what they may have in their life, and you as a friend to be able to speak into them and show up. You can lead someone to water, but you cannot make them drink.
Yes. Okay, next question is, how do you bring a friend to church and disciple them when they have no desire to come or learn?
I think they answered their own question.
Yeah.
You can't force someone, and Jesus wouldn't have forced it. You have to. People don't care what you know till they know that you care.
Right.
So you have to meet them where they're at again and love them there. And as they invite you into that, pray that their desires would change. And when they won't open Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they will open your life and mine, and make sure that what they're reading is super genuine. And we know that love is what draws people to themselves, not to be a Bible beating and weaponizing religion and scripture. That's probably the last most ineffective way to ever reach someone for Christ. So the church is not four walls. Your life preaches. Love them well.
Yeah. And I think, like, don't ever stop inviting, and invite in a loving way. Like, don't beat them down, like you
Force,
said, for not coming, but every week. And I mean, we do
Wanna go?
outreach. Yeah. And we do outreach on campus, and we'll come across people that we're just like, hey, do you want a donut? And they're like, no. And we'll just be like, okay, have a great day.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like you said, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink it.
It's a ministry of presence. Just show up. Just
And
show
I
up
think
in love.
also one of my biggest lessons that I took out of working at summer camp this summer was it was real. And I think even here and being in seasons where, like, I'll get on stage and preach, and I have been extremely humbled in the fact that I'll pray before every sermon that I go and preach, and God, I'll just ask him. I used to just ask him, like, God, just let people get saved from this. And he humbled me a lot in the fact that you will not always be put in a place every single day or every single week to save people. And I think that that is our lifelong goal, is to help as many people get to the kingdom of Christ before they pass away from this earth as we can. But every conversation is not going to be that. And I think that what we don't see is the seed that's originally being planted is just as important as the flower that has bloomed. And so sometimes you may just be that little seed that gets planted, and they may never, in the time of you being friends, come to church or come to know Christ, but maybe years down the road they're going to make that decision and look back and say, hey, this all started with so and so who invited me to church, and I didn't say yes, but she started that fire in me, that little tiny fire that eventually grew bigger, and now look at the friend that you've created. And so I think just being content in the fact that God isn't always going to bring through salvation through you to other people, but he will bring something to everybody that you encounter if you are living solely through him. So yeah, do you have anything?
No.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. This one is hard. How do you gracefully deal with a roommate that is a pathological liar?
Yeah. Well, grace is giving someone something that they don't deserve. So I'm going to answer that in two questions or two answers. One is that to grace, to give them grace and realize that's not about you, that's about them. Yeah. That's them having to live an alternate reality when they can't deal with truth, and probably started long before you. So the second part of that is, if you don't need to get a new roommate, which viably might be so, but hey, if y'all are sharing that room and it's working, you don't have to trust them. Yeah. Like, you can forgive them. That's obedience in Christ, but you can learn a boundary that says you don't have to trust them. You get to decide who gets real estate in your head and your heart. So you've got to make sure that you're the one who cannot let that get to you. Yeah. Right. Don't give them the space. If they are untrustworthy, don't let them speak into you.
I think I heard from Joe a long time ago, something that really hit me, because I dealt with my freshman year a really hard roommate situation. And she told me, I was so worried to stop being friends with this girl because I was like, she won't come to church anymore. And I knew that I was the only reason that she came to church. And I didn't want that to go away for her. And Jill looked at me and said, sometimes God doesn't call you to love people up close for forever. Like, sometimes you can love them, but from afar. And that doesn't, just because you stop associating yourself with that person doesn't mean that you don't love them, or doesn't mean that you don't want the best for them. But sometimes, and what she told me was, the moment that it starts affecting you and your walk with Christ, and your life, that may be the point where you step out and say, hey, I love you, I want the best for you, but you no longer serve a growing purpose in my life. And that's not a bad thing. Like, I think in today's world, it's just so like, oh, I can't hurt anybody's feelings. And it's like, you don't have to go into it ugly, but
no, just healthy boundaries are okay. And again, I'm going to go back to that core, that you cannot let what you cannot control you. You can only control how you respond to the situation.
Yeah. So the last question kind of ties into this, of how to navigate between quote unquote bad company and trying to lead lost people back to Jesus without letting them hold you back.
Yeah. So the Bible has a lot to say about bad company, about who you surround yourself with. And so I just want to go to the example of Jesus. Jesus spoke to the crowds, and then he had the 12 and he had the 3, right? So I would make sure that by the words of that question, the bad company is how you're living out your testimony and example to the crowds around you, right? And then the 12, like who you're hanging out with, to be wise in that, because Proverbs, the book of wisdom, says a companion of fools is going to come to ruin. And then that would lead us to the 3, right? The 3 really can't be the bad crowd. They need to be those you're allowing to speak into you. Right. And so evaluating your life and how effective you are as a believer is usually going to be that you're not unwilling to love people where they're at and to go into spaces. I mean, Jesus took this crowd of people to this place called Capernaum, and it was literally a pagan worship site that good Jewish people would never go to. And he said, upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. So if we're the church, we've got to be a light in the darkness. Light doesn't shine on light. But that said, the question of how do you be a light to bad people and keep good company? Your 3, your 12 probably needs to be those that are pursuing the same things of you, so as to lift and encourage each other up as you go out into the world, and not being drugged down by keeping one foot in both sides of the world. Because there's also a verse that says, man, a double-minded man is unstable in all he does. And a lot of times we edge that and feel that instability in our faith and in our walk and in our life.
Yeah. And I think one of the most important things, and I learned this because Pastor Nick used to tell us all the time, of like, you need to go where the lost people are. And so I would use that a lot as an excuse to just be like, okay, well, it's okay for me to go to the bar and drink because that's where the lost people are. And then I realized, as I've grown older and matured in my faith, of that's not meaning to go and spend your time
looking like them. Acting like them.
And I think it's okay to go where the lost people are, but you cannot go to where the lost people are if you are one of those lost people. You need to be found and saved and work on yourself in order to build up boundaries. And I had to learn that a lot because, I mean, my friends were in college. They love going out. And I did too. And I still loved to go and hang out with my friends, but for a long time I had to step back because I could not like go with them and uphold my boundaries at first. Like I had to take a step back and truly like understand like where God wanted me to be, and like
the temptations question. Know your weakness and create your boundaries.
And so for me, that was taking a step back and I mean, literally cutting off drinking from my life so that eventually I was able to go to the bars and hang out with my friends and go where the lost people were without falling into where the lost people were. And so, yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
I think that was perfect. I think sometimes we're just asking, how close to the fire can I get without being burned? And the answer is really, how far can you stay away so that you won't have to experience the wounds of
I love that analogy. You hit me with it every single time. I'm like, that's so good.
Yes. Those are awesome questions.
Yes. So we will come back next week with another episode just to wrap this up of all of the other questions. I think next week, let's see. There is questions
about anxiety and mental health, and I'm not going to do them. PJ is.
Yes, so. Pastor John will be here. We'll be talking about mental health, growing in Jesus, and in your walk with Christ, and a ton of other things. So we'd love to have you guys tune in again. Thank you guys for watching this week. We hope that something we said is able to help you in your walk with Christ. As always, we are here for you. We love you, and we will see you next week. Bye.